This afternoon, we're going to feature two policy roundtables. The first one is based on what is known as collaborative research in the ARC network. Earlier this morning, I talked about thematic research and then the peer review mechanism. Through that, we get researchers. And then what happens is that we get these researchers, resource people, and then others from around the globe to work on big issues that cannot be done by a single individual.
How time flies. It's sometimes, for some of us, 25 years seems like yesterday when we were here as young lecturers trying to understand how the workings of economies in Africa can be understood better. We were then young researchers who came together under the guidance of some very well-known researchers like Tony Kelly, Jerry Halana, and the rest, who under their tutelage, we managed to become what we are today. 25 years is worth celebrating. But I think in the morning when the chairman of the ARC was making his presentation, he alluded to the fact that that 25-year period and how Africa has come so far makes one think that maybe ARC training, ARC capacity building could have had an impact on the growth experience that Africa is witnessing now. Because at the time that we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, we all knew what was happening in Africa then. Growth was very, very poor. And now, Africa is one of the strongest areas when you want to mention anything about growth in the world. Is it sustainable? What are the drivers of such growth? What about employment? Is poverty coming down in Africa with all the growth that we're talking about? These are some of the issues which this afternoon we hope the panelists will bring to bear when they make their presentations. There will be actually one presentation by two presenters, Andy McKay and Abebe Shimelis. Andy has been with the ARC for a very long time. He's a professor of development economics at the University of Sussex, where he has worked since 2006. His main interests are in the areas of poverty and the dynamics of living standards, trade, agriculture, and distributional impact of policy. He was Associate Director of the DFID-funded Chronic Poverty Research Center from 2005 to 2011. He has been a resource person in Group D with the ARC and has helped with several collaborative projects on growth and poverty. Abebe is the manager of the Development Research Division of the African Development Bank. Previously, he has worked with the World Bank, the UNECA, Action Aid Addis Ababa, and Addis Ababa University in different capacities. His research interests are mostly
we were asked to do was to do a review of AERC collaborative research and talk about the policy implications. So we're going to try and do a summary of that in about 20 minutes. Okay, what we will do is we will talk a bit about the policy making in Africa and the history of policy making in Africa over the past 40 years or so. Then talk a little bit about the nature of collaborative research. I think many here are familiar with it, some may not be, so I thought I would briefly introduce the nature of collaborative research. In terms of synthesizing, there's so many collaborative research projects, we felt we couldn't synthesize everything. We've picked about 5, which we're going to give you a brief summary of those. Then, that we will divide between us, then Abebe will talk about an assessment of collaborative research, talk about research and policy impact, and some suggestions about future areas for collaborative work. If we just think about policy making in Africa, if we think back to independence and start at the beginning, countries had huge ambitions then. Countries had huge ambitions for what they were going to achieve. It was based on the understanding of the time. It was based on the dominant development economics thinking of the time. It was based on a desire to have reduced dependence. It was based on a significant role for the state. It was based on import substitution. We know that by the mid-1970s, this turned out to be financially non-feasible. That's partly as a result of world conditions in that time, but not just. And we know that that led into the era of stabilization and structural adjustment and so on. And we know the consequences of that for growth in Africa from the mid-70s to about the mid-90s. Over the same period, aid becomes more important. With this, with stabilization, with an increased role for aid, policymakers may start to feel less confident, less autonomy than in the sort of enthusiasm immediately post-independence. We think about the growth project, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which AERC did. That talked about lots of inappropriate policy environments and policies put in place in sub-Saharan Africa. That's particularly a story in the 80s and early 90s. Without doubt, policy making has improved in Africa in the last 20 years. We know about the growth recovery, we know about the better health outcomes, we know about the big expansion of education. Policy making has certainly improved substantially.